this out of the way without breaking it. Alright. So making sense of difficult verses in Genesis 1 through 11. Ready for this one? Ready for controversy? I would never do that, right? I would never get anything controversial. So, alright, so the goal in this presentation is to look closer at several, and I'm going to say controversial, but I don't mean that in the sense of, I think that we're going to get standing up and screaming and fighting. I don't think that's the case. I think in here that's not going to be all that controversial. It just means that scholars would disagree, or Christians in general disagree. Confusing or misunderstood passages, and the goal is to develop a better understanding of these foundational chapters of Scripture. Last night we talked about Genesis 1 through 11 is foundational to the rest of the Bible. And so with that in mind, let's take a closer look at some of those passages. So when it comes to interpreting the Bible, or any other form of communication for that matter, which of these questions is the most important to answer? Okay, most important. How does the modern audience understand it? How did the original audience understand it? Or what did the author mean by what he or she wrote? The last one? You guys think the last one is most important? So it's a really important question to ask because you'll see different traditions, different churches, different scholars who will pick any one of these three and they'll treat that as the most important. So if you look at our world today and you see a lot of churches that are caving to some of the societal pressures, some of the hot button issues in our culture, and to them the most important thing is number one. Right? How does the modern audience understand it? And we just twist it to fit the cultural needs. Of course, that's clearly not why the person wrote it, and that's not what was intended. And then there are other scholars who are still on the conservative side of things who will really go after number two, which, by the way, is an important question. So let's take a look at each of these real quick. It is important for us to understand how the modern audience understands it, because God has gifted men and women throughout the history of the church to study and understand His Word, right? And He's given pastors and teachers. We've got professors, we've got biblical scholars that get to spend their lives studying God's Word and teach it. And so we shouldn't just automatically reject what they say just because, well, they're a modern audience. Make sense? So we should pay attention to what they're saying. It doesn't mean we uncritically accept it. We need to compare everything to the Word of God, be like the Bereans. So there is a danger of simply just following a popular or respected teacher. Do we know people who do that? No, we hear this pastor on the radio, we love this pastor, and therefore, whenever a question comes up, well, so-and-so says this. Frankly, I don't care what so-and-so says most of it. If we're dealing with something, let's go back to what does the Bible say. And I don't mean that I don't care at all what so-and-so says, but that person is not the one who decides truth. That makes sense? And yet, this is very common. So, here's the other view, and this is, a lot of people will say, well, what does it mean to me? This is what this passage means to me. Well, again, it doesn't matter what it means to you. What matters is, what does it mean? So there's a very big difference. Meaning is not determined by the hearer or by the reader. If it was, so if a pastor was telling me that he's been here for about 5 years now, and meaning is determined by the hearer, and I heard that, I could say, yeah, I like pancakes too. I'm glad that's what you're talking about. And everybody would know that communication is impossible if that's how you think it. But you know what? This is popular in our postmodern culture. That's what they have taught in universities for years. They've taught that meaning is found in the mind of the recipient. And that's what postmodernism is. And then you have this, I think it was Richard Rorty wrote this really thick book all about how meaning is determined by the reader. And so somebody wrote like an 80-page response about just gibberish about what he really said in the book because it's up to the reader. And he responded, that's not what I'm talking about. It is too. The guy illustrated the absurdity of the position. All right, so how about the original audience? how did the original audience understand it? This is a really important question. And it's one that there are many scholars today who will go back to this all the time. And they think this is the most important one. It's not the most important, but it is a very important one. So there is a subtle nod to postmodernism in that it is looking at how did they understand it rather than what did the person sending it mean. So when Jesus taught the disciples, did they always understand perfectly what he was saying? No, but so the original audience can be wrong, can't they? So we can't always just go on what the original audience thinks. It's found, the meaning is found in the mind of the sender, not the receiver, and yet that's kind of what this view is promoting. And there's two major schools of thought that are doing this today, and that is, if you get into, if you're reading any sort of biblical scholarship about the Old Testament, you'll hear, especially before the exile, you'll hear all about, oh, in the ancient Near East, they did this, and they did this, and so this is what the Israelites believed. And what that means is the ancient Near East is like anywhere from Egypt all the way to Babylon, and like north to Syria, and all that whole region. And they'll say anywhere from like 2000 BC up until around 600 BC, the ancient Near East. And if there's one group that taught a certain thing at any time during that period, they're like, oh, Israel was copying this. Well, how do you even know that Israel knew about that? I mean, if somebody publishes a book today in Toronto, Canada, are you guys aware of it? Probably not unless it's a relative or something that told you. So you want to say a region that is that big, and even bigger than that the Israelites were aware of every single thing, and they were actually just borrowing and copying all of those ideas. And that's what a lot of scholars are doing today with this one. And they did the same thing, although it's a little safer in this case, they did the same thing with what's called the Second Temple period. So that is from the time of Nehemiah when they rebuild the wall, and Zerubbabel rebuilds the temple, the Second Temple, all the way up until the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. So that window of about 500 years, known as the Second Temple period. And the reason this is a little bit safer, one, we have a lot more writings, and two, they're all from Jews. So it's all from one culture, one group of people. But you have Pharisees later on, not at the time the temple was rebuilt, but you have later on by the time of the 1st century BC and 1st century AD. You have Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, you have all Zealots, you have certain groups all, so you can't think that they all believe the same thing, because they clearly didn't. So that's what a lot of people do. Are those things helpful to understand the background? Yes, but they do not determine meaning. That make sense? Did I lose here? Okay, feel free to interrupt if you need me to explain something more detailed. So the Bible, here's an important thing to remember, and this, think about it before you object. The Bible was written for us, it was not written to us. That makes sense? So Luke and Acts were written to Theophilus, not to me. 1st and 2nd Timothy, maybe, okay? Means you got the right name. But the Bible was not written to us because we weren't there at the time. But it certainly is for us. Make sense? Alright, so the author's meaning. This is really our goal. What did the author mean by what he wrote? It's clearly the most important question to understand, or to answer when interpreting the Bible. Because, as I mentioned before, sometimes the original audience misunderstood. So we need to discover the author's intended meaning, the aim. There's an acronym for you. For example, if I told you this statement, I enjoyed Jekyll and Hyde, what did I just tell you? Everyone guess? Did I tell you just that I liked a book? Did I tell you that I liked a movie based on that book? Did I tell you that I liked a musical based on that book? Or did I tell you that I liked a certain song and CD by that title by my favorite band? That's what I told you. But you wouldn't know that unless you know me, right? So the meaning is not found just in those words alone, it's after you know the sender and the context of what they're saying and why they would say those words. That make sense? Alright, so just a disclaimer up front, because there might be a couple of things in here when I talk about some controversial passages, you might be thinking, wait, are you saying that no, I'm not saying the Bible. Okay. I'm absolutely, I think you guys know this, otherwise you wouldn't have invited me. I'm absolutely committed to the full inspiration and inerrancy of the biblical text. Absolutely. If I challenge a view that you currently hold, I'm not claiming the Bible is an error. I'm simply exploring whether or not that the understanding, the interpretation that a lot of people have heard is a sound one. So, and if we happen to disagree, well, we can discuss it in a civil manner, right? We don't have to shout and scream.
Agree to disagree.
What's that?
Agree to disagree.
Yeah, sometimes.
But with civility.
With civility, and then always go right back to the scriptures. And then you'll see that I'm right. I'm just kidding.
Of course, you're a male, dear. Men are always right. We love you.
Well, see, you get it. I'm just kidding.
See?
Oh, I'm going to get in trouble if I keep
No, you're not.
All right. So there are a lot of different types of problems when it comes to interpretation. And we got to try to be aware of these things. So there are misinterpretations of the text based on trying to fit a desired outcome. Because you want the text to say something. And so you go into it with that in mind, and oftentimes that means you're going to, whether you're intentionally doing it or not, tweak things a little bit just to fit what you want it to say. And we are probably all guilty of that in some way, shape, or form. Because it's something that it's just what we do. That's how our mind works. We understand things in a certain way, so things get interpreted through that filter. So either trying to fit a desired outcome or fit a certain theological view that we have. In fact, the talk that I'm going to do on, I think it's Thursday night, we're going to start with some examples of that first one. When people are trying to fit a desired outcome or their theological views actually hinder them from understanding what the Bible is actually saying. Sometimes because we misread or misunderstand a different passage, and then because of that, it causes us to misinterpret something else that is related to it. Sometimes it's a failure to understand the broader context. For example, Matthew 16:18 is a very contentious verse between Catholics and Protestants. A very big one. And I think both of them are missing a huge piece of the puzzle when they debate this. So here's how it usually goes. Here's Jesus says, "Who do men say that I am?" And some say Elijah, some they go on, but then Jesus says, "Okay, but who do you say that I am?" And Peter, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of John, because flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it." Okay, so what does that mean? Well, if you're Roman Catholic, you've probably been taught that this means Peter has just been made the first pope. That's their traditional stand, that the church is going to be built upon Peter and his, and then his successors. Right after that, Jesus talks about the keys to all of those things, the binding and loosing. So they just think this is Peter being made the first pope. Now Protestants will typically focus on these two words, that you are Peter, the word there in Greek is Petros, and on this rock the word is Petra. So two forms of the same word, and Protestants usually will talk about the different nuances of those words. So you are Peter, little rock, and on this huge rock, this solid boulder, I'm going to build my church. And so what would that be? From a Protestant perspective, it would be Peter's confession. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And so on that confession, that is what the church is built on. Now theologically, that works. I think we could all say that those who believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, that's the confession we need to make. But is that really what Jesus had in mind? Are either of them right? Well, the Catholic interpretation runs into a problem, because what's the very next thing Jesus says to Peter? Skip down a few verses. What did he say? "Get behind me, Satan." I don't know if you want those words being spoken to your first pope right after he's been made first pope. That seems to be a problem theologically. Now I think what they would say is he's not actually made the first pope until Jesus, ascends, and then Peter's kind of left after that. So I think that would be their response. But are we missing something? Well, if you go back up in the text a little bit, it tells us that they came to the region of Caesarea Philippi. Now, I just happened to be in Caesarea Philippi a little over a month ago. And if you look in the back, all the way back there, see that very high mountain there? That is Mount Hermon, and we're driving to Mount Hermon there. And here's the four of us standing at Caesarea Philippi. And you've got the little tiny waterfall right there. And I'm going to zoom, we're going to actually go up to that place up behind us. See the cave there? That is to the right of the picture, to my left in the picture. Let me back up. So you can see the little niche in the wall. Actually, you can see other ones there, and if I were to pan over, you can see a whole bunch of them. This is where the temple of Pan stood, right at the foot of Mount Hermon. This is where Jesus and his disciples were, at Caesarea Philippi. That big cave right behind me, there's a shot of it. It actually keeps going down to the right. You can't go past the fence, so I couldn't get a better shot of it. And down, if you keep going deeper and deeper into the cave, there's a very, very deep chasm that they believed was like a bottomless pit, and they called that the gates of Hades. They thought that was a doorway to the underworld. And so Jesus is standing here, somewhere in this little area, and telling them that the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. On this rock I will build my church. Well, is there a big rock somewhere in that area? Yeah, the biggest mountain in Israel is right there behind us. It's right at the very northern tip of Israel, Mount Hermon, which also is where the Jewish traditions, the Jewish understanding that Genesis 6 passage about sunset, that's where they thought that those angels, the fallen angels, came down from Mount Hermon. And so that's why they think this is the gates of Hades. And so when Jesus uses that phrase while standing there, does that bring a different meaning to that verse? Or at least provide a little more background to it? That maybe there's a deeper understanding than just the traditional Protestant Catholic debate on that verse. Does that make sense? Sometimes we have to understand not just the culture, not just the words themselves, but also the geography of where they are and what's being said. Because remember, when he said it, they were in a certain area, they were looking at something, and he pointed it out to them. And so you would use the things that are around you. All right, so there are misunderstandings that are based on, that are not understanding the need to dig deeper and confront popular interpretation, because sometimes we just accept that what we've always been taught is the right one. So let me give you an example. This one gets controversial in certain churches, but here it is, Romans 9, 10 through 13. And not only this, we're going to focus at the end of it especially. Not only this, but when Rebekah also had conceived by one man, used by our father Isaac, for the children not yet being born, nor having done any good or evil, but that the purpose of God, according to election, might stand, not of works, but of him who calls, it was said to her, the older shall serve the younger, as it is written, Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. Okay, and this one comes out all the time when you get the whole Calvinism-Arminian debate. And so people just accept, oh, God hated Esau. Because that's what we hear all the time. Is that what that verse says? Well, it seems like that's what the words say. So it seems like that's what he's saying. Except for if you back up and you read, if you start at chapter 9, the whole context here is not about individuals. It's about the Israelites, the nation of Israel. What had God's plan for Israel failed? And Paul's saying, no, absolutely not. And he continues on, and he's talking about who really is Israel. It's the believing Jews. And he's still referring to the Israelites. He's not talking about individual election to salvation. That's not even the point of this passage at all. So what people have done in that whole debate is they've taken a 16th century debate and put that on a 1st century text. And then we continually hear, Jacob I have loved, Esau I have hated, except for, let's look at the last couple verses there. So before the children did anything good or bad, God says to Rebekah, the older shall serve the younger. So Esau shall serve Jacob, right? But if you go back in your Bible, Genesis 25:23, what does it tell us? 2 peoples, plural, are in your womb. 2 nations are in your womb, and the older shall serve the younger. It's not about the individuals. Oh, wait. Jacob I love, Esau I hated. That's from Malachi 1, 2, and 3, which is written, chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, which is written some 13 to 1400 years after they lived. And it's clearly talking about the nations that came from Jacob, which is Israel, and Esau, which is Edom. Now where you can demonstrate this beyond any shadow of a doubt. Did Esau ever serve Jacob? The individual? No. So, are we saying that the Bible is wrong? No, because it's not about the individuals. And yet too many people have just accepted that at face value because they think that's what, that's clearly what the words say, right? Well, but no, look at the original context of where he's quoting. Look at the context of Romans of what he's pointing out. He's not talking about individuals for salvation. That's not the point of this passage at all. And yet for the last 400 to 500 years, that's been the debate in the church, and that's not even what Paul is writing about. So a lot of times we don't even understand we need to look a little deeper. By the way, even when it says that Esau hated, it doesn't mean that God condemned Esau to eternity apart from him just because he didn't like him way before anybody did anything good or bad. That's not the point of the passage either. Hate is not the opposite of love. Especially in Greek here, it's love less than. So when Jesus says, if anyone comes to me who does not hate father and mother, does he really want us to hate father and mother? No, it's the same word. So that's not the point of this verse at all. And yet we hear this continually from well-known preachers, and we hear it from a lot of people in the church. And so they don't even understand that there's a need to dig deeper and look at the context of the passage, look at those verses, how they were used originally in the Old Testament. And Paul is not changing the meaning at all because he's talking about the nations, not the individuals. Well, nobody's shouting, nobody's fighting, that's good. We got through probably the most controversial one, the last one. Wait till the end, okay? That's the way to keep you here. Sometimes a mistake based on just a tradition, or mistake or tradition based on mistranslation, that can happen too. So I'm not going to give an example of every one of those right now, but we'll see as we go along some other examples. So how about when people have a desired outcome? Well, that's what happens when people are reinterpreting Genesis 1 through older lenses. They want to find any little tiny thing they can find that could be tweaked to say, well, maybe this could be interpreted this way, therefore it's millions of years. Rather than just very clearly, there was evening and morning. The first day, evening and morning the second day, evening and morning the third day, evening and morning the fourth day. It goes on and on and on. And the Bible's very clear on that. But nothing in the text anywhere suggests that somebody should insert millions of years. That's not, there's nothing in the text that gives that. And you want to argue, I've got a whole book just on that particular, that's what the older creationism on trial is all about, is what does the text say on this issue. And I looked at all of the arguments I could find from old earthers who are believers, who are trying to say, well, what about this argument or this argument? I'm looking at the arguments that they use, and there's nothing that holds up. So, if the text really did say it, how come there's no old earth used before 1800 when the gap theory was proposed? How come all of these different, some people call them compromise views, I'll try to be a little nicer, harmonize views, trying to harmonize the Bible with science, with this scientist of billions of years and everything. Where are those views before 1804? How come it's only once people started believing millions of years that suddenly somebody sees a gap, or somebody thinks you can interpret these as long ages, or all these other things? Because they're trying to use something from the outside to influence the text. The rest of the scripture consistent with the young earth creationists, like I showed last night. It puts theological problems like death before sin, which attacks God's nature. Sometimes because of how we misread something somewhere else. So, for example, I've got a book on the table back there on the sons of God and the Nephilim, almost 500 pages. And somebody, when I did my THM thesis on that, somebody thought, how could you write 145 pages on just those verses? And that's what I was wondering when I first started it. And then when I got into it, I thought, how can I only write 145 pages? And then I kept on writing, now it's almost 500, and I thought of a few more things I could put in there. But it's one thing that it's a little humorous. Don't do this to somebody who's done like their dissertation or thesis on a given topic. Don't use like the most obvious objection that people always use and act as if they've never heard of it. Because that's what people do to me all the time. Well, Jesus says that angels can't do this. No, he didn't. I mean, if I thought Jesus said angels couldn't do this, guess what? I would throw my book away. And I would pull it off. I would make sure that it's not in print anymore. But he didn't say that? It's because they're misreading that passage in Matthew 22:30. Jesus says, for in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels of God in heaven. He's talking about the holy angels who are in heaven, that they do not marry. He never says anything about whether they can or can't do it if they leave, if they abandon their proper abode. He's not even speaking about them. But in the parallel passage in Luke, it actually seems like he is endorsing the fallen angels, because then he talks about in the resurrection that we will be equal to angels and are sons of God. That's when we become sons of God at that point. And so it's almost as if he's endorsing that position. So if you're dealing with somebody who's really gone deep on a given subject, don't assume they've never heard of the most basic argument. Fair enough? So that's what that book looks like. Which, by the way, I'm not offended by somebody asking the question. That's fine. And it's just weird that some people would think that I would have never looked at it. I have 5 chapters all about the objections to that view. Because that's how I write things, that's how I argue. I don't just give my position, I give all the other positions and show why they do or do not work. So, all right. This, missing the broader context, likely the most common cause for misinterpretation. This one we've heard before. You hear it at graduation time. I'm glad we're past graduation time, so I don't have to get in trouble with all the parents who bought their kids cards that say this. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. Jeremiah 29:11. Was God writing, were those words spoken to us? No. They're spoken to Israelites who happened to be in captivity, in exile for 70 years. And God is saying, I'm not done with you yet. I know the plans I have for this people. Now, is there a general sentiment in that verse that maybe we could apply to us? Well, from an eternal perspective, yes. The plans that God has for us, when we talk about plans for a future and hope, yeah, if we're talking eternally, we're guaranteed eternal life with God the Father, and with God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. I mean, that is, you can't have more hope and better future than that. But are we promised long, healthy, and rich lives here on earth? You want to tell that to a person, a Muslim person who converts to Christianity in Saudi Arabia? Do you want to give that verse to them that day? Because they probably just signed their own death sentence. You see what I mean? So if we pull this verse out of context and we make if we give young people the impression that God's got this wonderful plan for you and everything's going to go great for you, well, life is hard on earth. People suffer. Some people suffer tremendously. And whether it's through illness or whether it's through mistreatment from others or all sorts of things, there's all sorts of reasons that people suffer. Ultimately, it all goes back to sin. And I'm not saying their individual, back to Adam's sin, all of that stuff comes into the world. So, Jesus said this in John 15:18, if the world hates you, it's because they hated me first, right? So what should we expect? Did they hate him? Yes. So what should we expect from the world? The same. Then when Ananias goes to baptize Paul, God tells him, I'm going to show him how many things he must suffer. You think that Ananias should have quoted Jeremiah 29:11 to Paul? By the way, you're going to stand before kings. Oh, you're going to be thrown in jail a whole bunch of times. You're going to get beaten a whole bunch of times. You're going to get shipwrecked and stoned and all these things. That's all going to happen to Paul. Great future. You see my point? So sometimes we miss the broader context because we like how a verse sounds. And so how about this? Sometimes just needing to dig deeper. Noah was mocked while he was preaching to the people, pleading them to come on board the ark, right? How many times have we heard that? A lot. Do you have a Bible verse that says any of that? Nope. There's not a single verse that talks about people mocking Noah. There's not a single verse that says he was pleading with people to come on board the ark. In fact, God already told Noah who's going on the ark. He said, my covenant's with you, your son, your wife, your sons, and your son's wives with you. That's who's going on the ark. So why would he invite other people? Because we want to turn it into an evangelistic passage and use it as an illustration of evangelism. But it's not. Now, I had one of our researchers at the ministry who got really upset with me one day for saying that. He's like, it is too an evangelistic passage. No, it isn't. Where is the gospel presented? It's not in that passage. Can it be used as an illustration? Absolutely. God judged the world with a flood, and everybody who was not on board that ark perished. Okay? So the ark, in a sense, was like salvation, but they weren't saved eternally because they were on the ark. They were spared from the physical consequences of the flood. They didn't die in the flood. Okay? Someday God's going to judge the world again, this time by fire, and provide a means of eternal salvation through Jesus Christ. So there are similarities, but they're not the same thing. So the point is, well, let me back up a little bit, just to be fair. Noah was a very godly man, right? Living in a very, very ungodly world, far more ungodly than our world, which is hard to believe. Do you think they mocked him if he was around other people? Yeah, they probably did. Based on how unbelievers treat believers today, that's a pretty safe assumption. But that's my point, it's an assumption. The Bible doesn't say that they did it. So let's just be careful how we talk about it. All right. Well, I told you there's going to be some on like poor translation. How about this one? How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. Isaiah 14:12, and we always talk about this passage being about Satan's fall. What if it isn't? It's very common in evangelical and conservative and fundamental Christianity to say this is Satan's fall. And maybe it is, but or to say that, well, Lucifer was like his angelic name before he fell, and now he's known as Satan. That's not what this verse is teaching either. Lucifer is from the Latin lux and pharaoh, so light bringer is what that word means. It's likely a reference to the planet Venus. And we know that the ancients, the Israelites, and throughout the Old Testament, you see how like the pagan gods and everything are referred to as the stars, sun, moon, stars, right? So here's what you have. In Hebrew, it's Hallel ben Shakar. It's Hallel, son of Shakar. So it means shining one, son of the dawn. That's how it should be translated. And so it's likely referring to Venus, which is this morning, the first star, planet, but the first one you see in the morning. And what many scholars believe is it's not actually about Satan himself, but about a lesser Canaanite deity who was saying these things. That he wants to sit, and the reason is because he said, I'm going to sit on the mount of the congregation of the north. Well, what is that all about? Well, I'm going to sit on Mount Zaphon. That's the word translated as north, is Zaphon. That's where the Canaanites believe that their chief god, El, and his council sat. And so it seems like there was a lesser Canaanite deity who said, I want to be the Most High in that pantheon. So it may not even be about Satan. Now maybe we're supposed to see it beyond that and see it being about Satan, but maybe not. Now, did Satan still fall from heaven in the sense that he sinned? Yes. But was he kicked out of heaven immediately? No, but that's how we often say it, isn't it? And yet in Job, he still had access. In Zechariah, he still had access. I happen to think he still has access. I think Revelation 12 is yet future, and that's when he's kicked out, is sometime during that tribulation period, and that's when he is extremely wrathful. Now, some people think it's at the time of the crucifixion or resurrection. I wouldn't debate too strongly against that, but I think, based on my own understanding of Revelation, I would say that it's still a future, that he still has access. Satan is the accuser, that's what the word means, or adversary, and that's what he's doing, he's accusing us. All right, so there's by way of introduction. Now we can get into the talk. You ready? We're going to go through several things in Genesis 1, Genesis 1 through 11, I should say. But what we're not going to cover, because we already did a little bit last night, the different interpretation of Genesis, different reinterpretation of Genesis 1, because it's not a result of a difficult passage. It's very easy to see what it says, but people just don't like what it says. The chronology of the flood account, that one can get very, very complex. And then we're dealing with a bunch of numbers, and it gets very confusing, and so I'm not going to use up the whole session just talking about that. So, here's the first one. Comes from Genesis chapter 1, and and some other places. There's some people who think there was a water canopy, a vapor canopy, ice canopy above the earth prior to the flood. So God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. It's day 2. And let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. Or if you have a King James or New King James, the word expanse is firmament there. And it was so. And God called the expanse or firmament heaven, and there was evening, and there was morning the second day. So, you can see from this verse how it would be somewhat natural to just say, okay, there's waters below the expanse, and there's waters above. So, there must be waters up there, right? Yeah. So it kind of makes sense from this verse how you could think there would be waters around the earth. And then you think later on in Genesis chapter 7, when the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the windows of heaven were open, and you get this torrential rain for 40 days and 40 nights. Well, where did all the water come from? Oh, maybe it was from this. Okay, that seems to fit so far. So that's kind of the idea. There's some people who have come up with different ideas of what this water canopy or vapor canopy or ice canopy, what that would do. They think it would block out harmful radiation. And so maybe that's why people could live so long back then, over 900 years. I'll show you why that's not the right interpretation. They would say, well, that's why maybe certain things got really big. Because we find in the fossil record dragonflies that were like 18 inches across. And Meganura is one. It's just pretty cool. It'd be pretty, I think, scary to see one. Really cool, but scary. But the problem, there's scientific problems, but there's also a textual problem that I'll show you. If there was some sort of canopy like that, actually it would create a greenhouse effect, and the earth would be so hot by the time of the flood that the ocean may have already boiled by that point. So it creates a lot of problems that way. Now, can God supernaturally take care of that? Of course. He can maintain the temperature he wants to if this sort of system was set up. But does the Bible even teach this idea? Let's continue looking at Genesis chapter 1, day 4. And God said, let there be lights where? In the expanse, or in the firmament of the heavens, to separate the day from the night. And let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth. And it was so. So if God separated the waters from the waters, He put the upper waters above the expanse. And the sun, moon, and stars are in the expanse. Where are the waters? Just around the earth? They have to be farther out, don't they? They would have to be out beyond the stars. So Genesis 1 does not unequivocally teach a canopy around the earth. It's one plausible way to interpret it, but this creates a big problem for the canopy model. If the waters are above the expanse and the sun, moon, and stars are in the expanse, you guys see the problem, right? The water would have to be out past the edge of the solar system. Or not just solar system, around the stars throughout the whole universe. The water would have to be at the edge of the universe if there's such a thing. Okay? So the canopy model is not demanded by the text. It seems unnecessary, and it has problems scientifically. Now, one of the guys I work with who is an astronomer, Danny Faulkner, believes that the water is at the edge of the universe. He thinks that's what astronomers are seeing when they measure what's called cosmic microwave background radiation. He thinks it's an effect of that water, which they would never imagine that there's water there, so they don't take that into account. I'm not smart enough in astronomy at all to tell you whether that's true or false. Okay? It's way over my head. Truly. It's a pun, but it's also true. I cannot do that kind of math. Alright. So how about this? Did God really say, the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made, and he said to the woman, as God indeed said, you shall not eat from every tree of the garden. Now, what's interesting in the Hebrew, there is no, what's known as like an interrogative particle. There's no hint in the Hebrew that this is a question. It's more of a statement. Indeed, God did say, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden. And yet every Bible translates it as a question. How come? But there's nothing in the Hebrew that, in those words in the Hebrew that indicates a question. And I have to be careful because as a ministry, what do we highlight all the time? We call this the Genesis 3 attack. Had God said? Did God really say? Well, how does Eve respond? it sounds like she's answering a question, right? The woman said to the serpent, we may eat the fruit of the tree of the garden, but the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, which that part we have no record of God saying not to even touch it, lest you die. So it seems like she's responding to the question, so maybe the serpent said, indeed God has said, that it's through intonation, the way that he is saying the statement that it comes across in the question. Does that make sense? But then we go on, and it says, the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die, for God knows that in the day that you eat of it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, or some translations will say gods, because it's just the word Elohim, and it can be translated either way, knowing good and evil. So, is that a lie? I've heard a lot of people say that, and I say, you know what, you got to be careful with that, because look at the very bottom, verse 22. God said, behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. God says that happened. So not every single thing the serpent said is a lie. When he says, you will not surely die, that's a lie. Okay, because God said, you will surely die. And the serpent said, no, you're not going to die. That's a lie. So he clearly lied, but not everything he said was a lie. Your eyes will be opened. Well, look at verse 7. Then the eyes of both were opened. That happened. And they knew that they were naked. Now, I don't know that they got exactly what they were expecting. I think that he was selling them something that I think it was probably being spun in a different way. They thought something better was going to come out of it. But even God himself says the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil. So let's just be careful about saying everything the serpent said was a lie there. Because oftentimes the way to deceive somebody is to include a lot of truth, right? But have one thing off. And clearly he did lie with the first part. And he may have been misleading in a sense of getting people in a certain way of what it means like you're like that kind of thing. Alright, who was Cain afraid of? You guys ever wondered that? That's kind of a strange thing, right? If Adam and Eve are the first people, and they are, they have Cain, then they have Abel. Cain kills Abel, and Cain says, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Surely you have driven me out this day from the face of the ground. I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth, and it will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me. Who's out there? Who's going to find him and kill him that's out there? A lot of people have come up with all sorts of speculations. Did God create other people? So you got Adam and Eve, and they're like the representative, but there's a whole bunch of people all over. No. Genesis 3:20 says that Eve is the mother of all living. We all go back to Adam. So no, God didn't create other people. Some people will say, well, Genesis 4, this kind of goes back to similar to the question you asked before we started about Genesis 1 and 2. There's some people who break up all these different chapters or different sections and say, oh, they're written by different people, and there's just this contradiction. So Genesis 4 originally was disconnected from the first three. That's kind of a typical liberal scholar approach. And they'll say it's just this whole difficulty as a result of a naive editor or redactor during Ezra's time is when they usually claim. But how about we just dig a little deeper? How old was Cain when he killed Abel? And we know. We can't get an exact age, but can we get pretty close? Well, Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth. For God has appointed another seed for me instead of Abel, whom Cain killed. So Seth is born sometime after Cain kills Abel, right? See that?
I'm going to put this in my drawer.
Yes. And probably the first son after Cain kills Abel. That makes sense. God has appointed another seed, so there's another male instead of Abel, because Abel was killed by Cain. So it seems like this is the first boy being born after Cain kills Abel. How old was Adam when Seth was born? And Adam lived 130 years and begot a son in his own likeness after his image and named him Seth. Meaning that Cain and Abel may have very well been in their 120s when this happened. Because the very next son being born was when Adam was 130. You see that? And we often picture Cain and Abel as being like teenagers or like very young men, like they're just in their early 20s or something like that, or late teens, and Cain killed them. Now they may have looked like that because if you live 900 years, you probably age a lot slower. But they may have very easily been in their 120, which means they may have both been married already and maybe already had kids. Abel may have already had kids. He may have had adult kids already. He may have been a grandfather already. And they would have other brothers and sisters, not just Cain, Abel, and Seth. Genesis 5:4 says that Adam and Eve had other sons and daughters. Now who would Cain be afraid of? How about some of his close relatives, like his own brothers and sisters, or maybe his nephews, Abel's sons, if Abel had sons. I'm not saying that he did that, the Bible doesn't tell us whether he did or not. But it's very reasonable that he may have. But we don't often think about how old they were at that point. Now it makes perfect sense, because if God created other people, which he didn't, that would create problems theologically everywhere else. But even if he did, why would they care about Cain? If Cain wanders off, he goes 100 miles off to the east, to the land of Nod, and there's some other people dwelling there already. Who's this guy? I don't know. He's just somebody who came from the west. He doesn't have to tell him, oh, by the way, I killed my brother. That's why I'm wandering around. They're not going to care or know. So that's kind of a silly answer. I think the real solution is just dig deeper and look closer at what's really going on there, but we don't usually think about it that way. So, yeah, there would have been quite a few people already by that point. By the way, if the Septuagint numbers are correct, and we're not going to get into that debate tonight, Adam would have been 230 when Seth was born, which would give you even 100 more years of more and more people being born who might be upset about what Cain did. All right, well, speaking of long lives, did people really live over 900 years? The answer is yes. Okay, next one. They did, because the Bible tells us they did. All the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. So all the days of Seth were 905 years, and he died. Noah lived 950 years. Methuselah lived 969 years. Enos, who's the next generation after Seth, 912 years. So several people lived over 900 years. So, did you know that there is another document, one of the oldest things that we have written, called the Sumerian Kings List? It's dated to about 2000 BC. So a very, very ancient document. And it lists all these ancient rulers of Sumer. So one of these earliest, was often considered to be the earliest civilization in the Fertile Crescent, in that area with modern day Iraq and everything. So they list 10 rulers before the flood, before this great flood that wiped everything out. And they seem to be exaggerating quite a bit, because each of these guys reigned over 18,000 years each. Obviously, you're living a long time if you can reign for 18,000 years. Then this great flood comes, and all of a sudden, all these numbers are reduced drastically, and they're reigning to fewer than 1,500 years each. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? Now, the numbers are different than what the Bible says, but in the Bible, they're living over 900 years before the flood. All of a sudden, the flood comes and suddenly drops out of the 400s, and then out of the 200s, and then the 100s. Very similar, just with a different scope and numbers. And there's another similarity. In Genesis chapter 5, you read about Enoch, who walked with God, and then God took him. Right? And Enoch didn't see death. God took him when he was 365 years old. Enoch is the 7th one in the list. This guy, Emiduranki, is also the 7th ruler in that list before the flood, and he was also taken to heaven by the gods. It's as if the Sumerians, the ancient Sumerians, knew this history from before the flood, and they were writing it down in their way and exaggerating. But it's very, very similar. All right, but let's take a look at what happened in Genesis 6:3, and this is right in the middle of that passage about the sons of God and the Nephilim. So if you have my book called Fallen, there's a whole chapter just on this 120 years thing. The Lord said, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, and his days shall be 120 years." That's the New King James. Now, the HCSB says, "My spirit will not remain with mankind forever." The ESV says, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever." The Net Bible says, "My spirit will not remain in humankind indefinitely." So, what's going on in this passage? It goes on and says, "His days shall be 120 years." So what does that 120 years refer to? Well, there are some people who think it refers to the countdown to the flood. That there's going to be 120 years from the time that passage was spoken, and then the flood's going to come. But remember, that's Genesis 6:3. There's no mention of the flood until verse 17. The flood's not even in that immediate context. Judgment is mentioned in verse 7, but the flood itself is not until 17. Who did God say this to? If you read that passage, Genesis 6:1-4, who is God even speaking to in 6:3? The Lord said, my spirit will not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, his days shall be 120 years. It doesn't tell us. He doesn't say, this is what God said to Noah. Noah, go and warn everybody they got 120 years to repent. That's how some people will take that passage, but there's no mention of that. And there's no mention of man's response to it. Okay, like in Nineveh, Jonah goes about 40 days and Nineveh will be overthrown. You hear about what happens with the Ninevites, right? They repent. And Jonah gets mad at that for some reason, which is really weird. But he did. He had the wrong attitude. And I'll tell you why. It's because this 120 years is not about a countdown to the flood. There's something else going on. The academic commentaries that are out there are completely against this idea of a countdown to the flood, because there's another explanation that fits the context perfectly. And that is that it's a declining lifespan view, that God is going to reduce man's lifespan down to 120 years. That's what most commentaries teach, and think about what happens right after this. So, Noah lived 950, all the guys before him except for Enoch, who's 365, and then Noah's dad, Lamech, dies at 777. Everybody else in that list in Genesis 5 lived over 900 years. And then you have Noah. Maybe one is 895. Somebody that come up afterwards and say, you said everybody. There might be one more. So Noah's 950. His son Shem lived to 600 after the flood. So he lives 500 years after the flood. He died at 600. His son Arphaxad, 438. There's a name listed there in Canaan. That's in the Septuagint. There's an extra generation that's in there that's not found in most of our Bibles, which are based on the Masoretic. So that's 460. Shelah is 433. Eber's 464. Look what's happening. 239, 239, 230, 140. There's a steady decline, right? With a few little tiny bumps. All the way down to the guy who wrote that passage, who happened to live how long? 120 years. How many people after Moses lived 120 years? One. Jehoiada the priest lived 130. He's the one that saved baby Joash from being wiped out and kept the line to the Messiah intact. Alright, so put yourself in the sandals of an Israelite wandering in the wilderness, hearing and reading these words for the very first time. Okay, so Moses has been given Genesis. He's going through Genesis chapter 5, and you're hearing these words for the first time. Adam lived 930 years and he died. Seth lived 905 years and he died. Enos lived 912 years and he died. And go down. Methuselah, 969. What are you thinking?
Got a long ways to go.
We've got a long ways to go, except for everybody around you hasn't come close to that. Your grandparents were dying around 125, 130, 140. You think, wait a second, what happened? Right? And so the very next passage tells exactly what happened. That's Genesis 6:3, right in the context of the sons of God and the Nephilim. And what was going on there. And so there's incredible wickedness in the world. It's as if God is saying, look, I let you live almost 1,000 years. And look how exceedingly wicked you become and the things that you do. So from now on, as a way to curb that wickedness, you get 120 years. And from that point on, you see a steady decline to 120 years, and then nobody passes it after that except for Jehoiada the priest. So, some people will say, well, yeah, but that means there's delayed judgment. Well, lots of judgments delayed. Even the other view has delayed judgment, delayed by 120 years. So how is that an objection? In Psalm 90, verse 10, man's days are 70 or 80 years, right? If I measure from 80. Moses wrote that. That's the Psalm of Moses, Psalm 90. Well, Moses lived more than 70 or 80 years. He lived 120. But average, 70 years. So he's not saying nobody ever breaks that. So there's the exception, Jehoiada the priest, 130. If you look online, for the oldest lived person in recorded history, so they won't of course use the biblical one, even though that's recorded history. They'll talk about a woman named Jean Calment, who allegedly lived from 1875 to 1997, which would make her 122 years when she died. I say allegedly, because Jean Calment almost certainly died in 1934 at the age of 59. And then her daughter, who did not want to pay a very steep inheritance tax in France, because they just paid it for her father, didn't want to pay it for her mom as well, took on her mom's identity, moved out of town for about 20 years, and then lived the rest of her life under her mom's assumed name, which is why when she got to be 100 years old, and people first started to recognize her, actually it was when she was 110, they started to recognize her. Everybody said she always looked like 20 to 25 years younger than everybody else her age. Because she was. A few years ago, there was a book, or not a book, a paper by Nikolai Zach, who has exposed Calment as a fraud. And there's still a lot of people who like her being 122 years old. When you go through his paper and you look at what he's compiled, it's very obvious that she was a fraud. By the way, I'm not opposed to somebody living past 120 years. God can make exceptions. It's appointed for a man wants to die, and after this a judgment. Yeah, except for Lazarus' case, right? Or Jairus' daughter, or all the other people that were raised from the dead. They died twice. So God can make exceptions. That's not a problem. So my complaint against Jean Calment is not that, well, that would mean that's an exception to your interpretation. No, it's because she's almost certainly a fraud. So Jean died of pleurisy in 1934, age 58, I said 59, and then her daughter takes on her identity and then dies at age 99, but everybody thinking that she's 122. When she was 110 and became famous, Jean, who was actually her daughter, orders all of her family pictures and records to be destroyed. Why would anybody do that? That's a really odd thing, especially if you're getting up there in years and may not have that much time left. You might want those things for memory, right? No, she wants all the pictures and everything destroyed because it would prove that she's a fraud. She made a whole bunch of slip-ups. She even kind of said, God has forgotten my name. As a joke, because she was not who everybody thought she was. All right? So there's not really that exception, but I don't care if there is an exception. This one, let me just throw this out there as like the grenade in the middle of the room. See what you guys think. I'm not gonna take a stand on this all. I just have an idea that I'd like to explore a little more. Okay, so that's all I'm saying with this. In Genesis 2:17, God said, "But of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die." Have you ever wondered how come they didn't actually die that day? Well, I mean, we think about it because they needed to have Cain and Abel and Seth, and we got to have people, right? So God didn't want to, because God allowed the animals to be sacrificed in their place, apparently. So how can they didn't die that day? So what do we usually do as a church? We say, well, they died spiritually. But that's not the context of what's being said here. Nowhere does it say in Genesis they died spiritually, which, by the way, I'm not arguing against that idea. Yes, they were separated from God, clearly. Okay? So the concept of spiritual death surely is taught elsewhere in Scripture about that. So I'm not arguing against that, but what if there's a different meaning here? What if, just throwing the question out there, I'm not standing on this. What if when God uses day in an eschatological sense, like in a sense of future judgment, it actually does mean 1,000 years? So when God says in the day you eat it, so when a day is like 1,000 years, and that's in the context of 2 Peter, when he's using that's in the context of Christ's return. Okay? So what if the day of the Lord is that 1,000-year period, that millennium? What if what God is saying is they won't live past 1,000 years? Adam died at 930. Nobody, as far as we know, lived past 1,000 years. It would be consistent with that, but here's one of the big problems with it. I don't think that you can prove every single time the day of the Lord or anything like it means 1,000 years. Another big problem, how would Adam ever know that God really means 1,000 years there? Maybe God told him more than was written, I don't know. So that's why I'm just throwing out there as a possibility. It would make, to me, it would make more sense than the way we typically interpret that. But I don't know if it fits perfectly with the rest of the Bible. So don't take that as Tim said this is the perfect interpretation of the no, I'm not saying that, okay? I'm just speculating right there. All right, when was Babel? Well, after the flood, right? Yep, good enough. So the common creationist view, this is what we would, so there are times I end up in the principal's office at work. Because I don't always go along with what everybody else says. I'm willing to challenge it if I'm convinced the Bible says something differently. And here's what I'm going to think about this as, oh, this Peter, is this going online? I mean, I always say everything exactly. No. We need to be willing to challenge things if we're convinced Scripture says something different. Does that make sense? And that means if you think that I've said something wrong and you are convinced Scripture says it, then stick with Scripture, not with what I say. But oftentimes we'll hear that it was in the days of Peleg. To Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. So usually when we see the earth was divided, that's Babel. And a lot of times, like Usher would put it when Peleg was 5 years old. Some creationists said, no, it's when Peleg is born. But there's some problems with that approach. The phrase "in his days," when it says Peleg, in his days the earth was divided, it never refers to one's birth. That phrase is used throughout the Old Testament. Now, when it's referring to a woman, sometimes a pregnant woman, sometimes it's while she's pregnant in her days. At the time when so it uses it that way a couple of times. Almost every other case is referring to a king, like during his time of reign, in his days as he was reigning, or it could be a person's whole lifespan. Okay, it's not just when the person was born. In fact, it's never that. So why would we make it that in this passage? So here's one example. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. In his days, Bethel built Jericho. So in Ahab's days, not when Ahab was born, the same sort of thing. In his days, this is about Josiah. In his days, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went to the aid of the king of Assyria. So it was during his reign. So other problems, that phrase "earth was divided" is a different word. Word divided is a different word than what happens later on when it's clearly talking about Babel. The nations were spread out. That's one verb used to describe it. When the Lord scattered them, that's a different verb than divided. So in both cases, there's different verbs than that one. It's a different word being used. And that word that is used there, earth was divided, only appears four times in the Bible. Genesis 10:25 and 1 Chronicles 1:19. Well, 10:25 is the verse we read. 1 Chronicles 1:19 is just the repeat of that, is that chronology, or the genealogy in 1 Chronicles 1. In Job 30:25, we have this: who has divided a channel for the overflowing water, or a path for the thunderbolt? Then in Psalm 55:9, this is what most people will look to: destroy, O Lord, divide their tongues, for I see violence and strife in the city. So that's that. See, division of tongues, this division of languages. Actually, what if it's to be taken more literal than that? Actually, divide the tongue as a punishment because of the violence. Because what does it mean here? It is digging canals or digging channels, and that's what the related words are all about. It's like irrigation. So what would that mean in Genesis 10:25? It's not about a breakup of the continents. That would have happened at the time of the flood, not during Peleg's day. It may very well be a reference to the digging of canals, which is an agricultural innovation. Okay? If that seemed weird to you in the middle of the genealogy, look back at Genesis chapter 4 when it's talking about Cain's line. And it gets down to people from Lamech, not Noah's dad Lamech, but this other Lamech who was a polygamist and murdered this guy and bragged about it. He says that he had two wives. One of them gave birth to Jubal and to Jabal. They were the fathers of those who played musical instruments, and then the other one, those who had livestock and dwell in tents. And then it talks about Tubal-Cain, who was an instructor of all kinds of bronze and iron. So it started telling you about these different innovations right here in the middle of the genealogy. What if that's what it's doing here? It's telling us about Peleg in his day. That's when this irrigation was perfected or started to be used. So, I have to do that from memory. I have to just show you. All right, sorry, I'm glad that the verse on there. Here's an alternative view. Genesis 10 already tells us when Babel was. So why is it going to tell us again? It tells us in Genesis 10:10, in the beginning of his, talking about Nimrod, his kingdom was Babel. There it is, the Nimrod thing. And then Eraphakad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. So, when did Nimrod live? Well, you have Ham, whose son is Cush, and then Cush's son is Nimrod. So, he would be Noah's great-grandson. And in his generation, if you look at that line from Seth, they were the people who were living around 450 years in that generation. So his lifespan would have overlapped Peleg's lifespan. So it could still be in Peleg's day, but I don't think that's what that verse in Genesis 10:25 is saying. Does that make sense? Yes, no, maybe so. It's hard to go against what we've always heard, right? But either way, it's not. It would still probably be during his lifespan. It's just, I don't think that's what 10:25 is telling us. And one point that I hesitate to say this because it can come across in an arrogant way, and I don't mean it that way at all. If you think about the, by the way, the interpretation I just gave you is the dominant view in almost every academic commentary you'll find. And I'm not saying that the academics are always right. They're not. Okay? Some of them are very liberal and they don't believe a word of it. And nobody's infallible other than God. So they can make mistakes. But one of the things we as creationists need to do a better job at is to be willing to evaluate the things that the people who have gone on before us have said. So like Henry Morris, very godly man, and did some great things. He's kind of the father of modern creation movement. He was a hydrologist, a biblical scholar. You know, a lot of the leaders of the creation movement have not been biblical scholars, and so they haven't really dug deep into some of these things. And so something gets said, and everybody just kind of follows because they're great men, and they are. But it doesn't mean that they always get something. It doesn't mean that I'll always get things right. That makes sense. So we do need biblical scholars who will look into it, who will still believe what's written there. All right, so you guys want to do this one? It looks like we still have time. What did Ham do? Have you ever wondered that? What was so bad? What he did? All right, do we have kids in here? I think this is, the language I'm going to be using is PG. The content itself, what it's about, is PG-13. Just give you a disclaimer. Is that fair enough? But I won't be using any gross language, but you guys will understand what's going on. There are 4 different views about what Ham did, 4 major views. So here's what it says. Now the sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Ham was the father of Canaan. That's strange. Why does it tell us that Ham was the father of Canaan? It just tells us about the 3 boys, and then, well, suddenly let's tell us something about Ham. We'll come back to that. Ham was the father of Canaan. These 3 were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. And Noah began to be a farmer, and he planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine and was drunk and became uncovered in his tent. And I know some people try to make excuses for, well, he didn't know about fermentation. How do we know? We don't have to make excuses for Noah. He was a sinner, just like the rest of us. He was a godly man, yes, but he still was a sinner. So we don't have to try to make excuses for him. In fact, that's one of the interesting things about the Bible is it almost always shows us the faults of our heroes of the faith. One of the only ones I can think of who there's a significant amount written about would be Daniel. And most of the other ones, David's a great hero of the faith, right? But, yeah, David messed up a lot. Okay? And so that's one of the things that shows that the Bible is very authentic. It doesn't hide those things from you. It's telling you about them because Christ is the only one that's perfect. All right. So he drank the wine and was drunk and became uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, wait, it just told us that. Now tell us again, the father of Canaan. Isn't that weird? Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their fathers were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. Okay? In the most straightforward way, the way we read that in English, Noah's lying in his tent, uncovered. Ham sees him, kind of goes and tells the brothers. It doesn't say that he was mocking him, even though that's kind of how we read it, right? And so Shem and Japheth take a blanket, walk backwards, and a garment, and lay it on him, and they don't see their father's nakedness. That's how we traditionally read it, right? Yes? Because that's the most comfortable way to read it. But, so Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done to him. Then he said to him, "Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants he shall be to his brother." What did Canaan do? Why is he the one that gets cursed? Ham's the one who apparently did something wrong, right? So, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And he said, "Blessed be the God of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant." Poor Canaan. He didn't even do anything. "May God enlarge Japheth, and may he dwell in the tent of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant." By the way, let's make sure we get this out of the way right here. No, this is not where dark-skinned people came from. This is a lie that was taught back in the 1700s and in the 1800s. There have been certain groups that have taught this. That is absolutely not what's being taught here. Okay? I think we all know that, but I just want you guys to understand, because some people talk about the so-called curse on Ham, and they'll say, "Oh, that's for black people." There's no curse on Ham. It's on Canaan. And that's not the origin of people with darker skin. It's ridiculous. But there are racist attitudes that have come up in the past, and that was something that was used to justify slavery in the United States a couple hundred years ago. So just be aware of that. So I've already talked about we don't need to make excuses for Noah, and covered that one as well. All right, so 4 sins. It's the 4 different views. I told you PG-13 content. Okay, I gave you a warning. The first one is the one we just talked about, the voyeur, that he sees his father naked and then kind of is disrespectful. Maybe he goes and brags, or just says, "Dad's such a lush," that kind of thing, you know. And the second one is pretty weird, that he emasculated or castrated his father. That's a strange one. The third one has become more popular in our day, and you can probably figure out why, because of the way our culture is going, and this particular sin that has been pushed quite a bit, and this one is paternal incest. So Ham did something physical to his father. Okay? And the fourth one is that he didn't do something to his father, he did the same thing. He did that to his mom. Okay? Alright. So let's take a look. Here's the first one. Ham saw his father uncovered and then boasted or mocked him in front of Shem and Japheth, which it doesn't say he boasted or mocked, but there's something going on there that the other brothers did something different than what Ham did. So where does it ever say that it was a sin to see somebody's father naked? When the Bible talks about seeing father's nakedness, it's about something else. If you read Leviticus, and we'll see a couple verses, okay? So it's not about actually physically seeing, for a son to see his father without clothes on. It's not something that's described as being sinful in the Bible, so why would this be a sin? It could be that he's disrespectful and mocking him, okay, but then why would Canaan be cursed? There's no explanation for why Canaan gets cursed here, is there? Okay? How about this one? Well, this one's really strange, but there's a very loose parallel in Greek mythology. The first two, well, Uranus is the god of heaven, that's the word in Greek for heaven, and then Gaia is the earth goddess, and they were going to come together, and the Titans came along and held them down, and one of them, Kronos, did that to Uranus. Now that's really weird. Why is there a connection here? Because one of the Titans who held him down is named Japheth. And the blood from that is where all the people came from. So it could be the Greek mythology view of like a complete embellishment and legendary view of what originally happened. Like the first people after the flood, and they even recognize the name of one of the ancestors, Japheth. But there's no hint of that action in the text. It's never said that at all. Okay? But it does provide a possible, this is strange, a possible reason for the cursing of Canaan, because Canaan, when it lists Ham's sons, that Canaan is Ham's fourth son. And because Noah, according to this, he was prevented from having a fourth son, maybe that's why he cursed Ham's fourth son. A little bit strange, it's a stretch. I don't think this is the right view. The next one, remember, we tried to keep language PG. This is where Ham did something specific to his father himself. So in Leviticus 20, it uses father's nakedness as an idiom for sexual activity. Verse 24 talks about what his youngest son had done to him. And so because of how popular LGBT activism is in our day, there have been a lot more people who are pushing this interpretation and saying, well, that's what happened. But if that's the case, there's no reason to curse Canaan. Notice, we haven't come up with a reason to curse Canaan in any of these, have we? It's just a weird thing. And why does it tell us twice that Ham is the father of Canaan before it even gets to the passage, before it tells us what Ham did wrong? And father's nakedness is about something else. It's not about doing something to your father. Okay? The other ones, the maternal incest views that Ham had an affair with his mother. Whether it was willing or forced, that's not the point, okay, in this case. Seeing someone's nakedness in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy is the same as sexual activity. And when you see your father's nakedness in those passages, it means that you did something to your father's wife. That's what those passages mean. I'll show you. If a man takes his sister, his father's daughter or his mother's daughter, and sees her nakedness, she sees his nakedness, it is a wicked thing. Okay? In other words, they have that sort of relationship. They shall be cut off from the sight of the people. He has uncovered his sister's nakedness, shall bear his guilt. So seeing nakedness is the same as sexual activity, and the father's nakedness refers to the father's wife. The man who lies with his father's wife has uncovered his father's nakedness. See that? Both of them shall be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them. So here's where this starts to make a lot of sense. Ham goes out and tells his brothers. Why would he do that? Let's just assume the fourth view is the right view. And he just did that to his mom. Why would you go tell your brothers? Seems like something you would want to hide, right? Except, don't we see the same sort of thing in many other places in the Bible? Reuben takes one of Jacob's handmaids, essentially one of his wives. So he has a relationship with his dad's concubine. Absalom does the same thing when Absalom takes over the palace in Jerusalem and David's on the run. He takes 10 of the concubines and sets up a tent on top of the palace and does that in full view everywhere. Adonijah, who is David's son, David's family didn't turn out so well. Just so I think you guys understand that if you read that, it's tragic. That after David dies, the last woman that was with David was a young maiden who was brought in to keep him warm, is what it talks about near the end of David's life. The implication is that there was another reason for it as well. But Adonijah, who thought he was going to be the king, who starts to make himself king, and then suddenly Solomon made king while Adonijah's out there partying, thinking he's going to be the king. He comes in and pleads to have his life spared. Solomon spares his life as long as he proves to be a good man. Well, then he comes back and he asks Solomon's mom, Bathsheba, for one thing, and that is to give him Abishag as wife. And for that, Solomon puts him to death. Why? What do all of these things have in common? Because it says that the son is trying to take the father's authority. If I do this, then that means I have the authority. Ham is the youngest. If he does this, then he's the one who has the authority, which makes sense why he tells his brothers about it. And it also provides the best, and I would say probably the only explanation for the cursing of Canaan. What if Noah's wife became pregnant as a result of this? And Canaan was that child. Now, does it make sense? Why can't he get cursed? Because he's an illegitimate child. Now think about what else that would mean. Who are Israel's closest enemies when they go into the land? Canaan. And according to this interpretation, who are they from? Well, from him and his mom. The Moabites, who are they from? Well, remember when Lot fled from Sodom and his wife gets turned into a pillar of salt and they go and live in the cave with his two daughters? What are his two daughters doing? Same sort of relationship, right? And from there you get the Moabites and the Ammonites. So in other words, it would be like setting up, the passage would be setting up what is about to happen so that Israel knows where their three main enemies come from, and they are all illegitimate. So if that is the right interpretation, now it makes sense with the rest of the scripture. It makes sense with why Canaan gets cursed. There's still some assumptions built into that. The text does not come straight out and tell us, and as a result, Noah's wife became pregnant. It doesn't say that. It does say when Noah saw what his youngest son had done to him. And so maybe months down the road, he realizes, oh, there's an issue there. And it would be some time before Canaan gets cursed. It would be 9 months or so once Canaan is born. So there's assumptions built into it. There's difficulties with each of you. I think that one has far more explanatory power. And it helps us understand why Canaan gets cursed. It makes sense of the language about that's used elsewhere in the Bible, about the terminology that's used there. So sorry for the people who just came in and got the very tail end of that. I'm trying to not get into some of the details because that would be an awkward, strange thing. So that's the end of that presentation. It's really starting to line up out there, so I should wrap things up. So we got through the difficult passages. We got through controversial ones without you guys dragging me outside the stone, so I appreciate that. Thank you. So, are they ready to come in, or do we have time for questions? Some out here. I'm hoping we don't have a question on this one because this is. I'm just kidding.
We're ready.
All right, I didn't get off the stage fast enough. All right, go ahead.
I don't think they're coming up.
Okay, I just saw people milling around me, but I don't see a bunch of kids and there's not a lot of noise, so I think we got time. Go ahead.
You have time.
Okay. Did you have a question too, or you just okay? Yeah.
Would you be willing to email that entire report?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, good.
Yeah, just give me your email address afterwards, and yeah, you can.
Wonderful, because I'm pretty good at keeping up, but that last part, I couldn't ask it up.
I went through pretty quickly and was trying to be careful with the terminology. I
Oh,
promise.
you did fabulous.
Thank you. I promised it would be PG language on a PG-13 topic. So,
Well, I'm sure as adults, we,
yeah, well,
yeah.
some younger ones in here too.
Oh, I didn't see that.
This is like
Thanks.
You got time for a question or two?
Yeah, I think so, yeah, if anybody has any. But again, same rule of lesson, no hard ones. For how many of you was for the last thing that I covered? How many of you was it the first time you've ever heard that? It's.
It makes sense, though.
That's what I was going to ask. How many of you think it makes sense when you hear it in that like that? Even though it's disturbing, and that's one of the things we got to keep a reminder of. Sometimes we don't like an interpretation. By the way, I don't like it either. I hate that idea. You know, if I'm somebody who's written 3 novels about Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, and I don't like the idea that people have written about that something like that would have happened in that family. But if that's what the text is telling us, then that's what happened. So.
Well, in Greek, it could be in a theologian. Don't you find in Greek and Roman mythology a great similarity in many of the stories?
You do find, not just in Greek and Roman mythology, in fact, you find all around the globe a lot of similarities to Genesis 1 through 11.
Yes.
We've got pictures of Australia all over the place, or things from Australia. Even the Australian Aborigines, or the indigenous Australians, I think is the way they prefer to call them today. They have legends about how man was made from clay. They have a story about how the reason man became bad is one day he came too close to this tree, and there was this great bat that was there, and the bat flew away, and as a result, since then people have become bad and sinful. They have flood legends. They have all sorts of these legends that sound very similar to Genesis 1 through 11, and then nothing after Genesis 11, because they came from Babel as well, and they knew that history, and they passed it on. And it gets distorted through the years, but you find that all over the globe. And so it wouldn't surprise me if there is some sort of hint in some sort of mythology to the one. That's why I would say that the Greek one, even though it seems so bizarre, at least it does sort of kind of maybe explain the Canaan issue, whereas the other 2 don't really explain that at all. And so it's almost like, remember at the beginning of the passage it tells us that Ham, the father of Canaan, and it goes down a little point, and Ham, the father of Canaan. It's like telling you, this is how Ham became the father of Canaan. And then that's how that interpretation makes a lot of sense. Even though there's still some built-in assumptions. All right, anybody else have a question before we end it? Anybody upset at me for talking about that? I'm willing to admit it. Send emails to Pastor, don't ever invite that guy back. What he talked about. So.
compared to some of the commercials that we have on, this was tame.
That's true. It's just
Okay.
that- Yeah, but you shouldn't have to be subjected to some of that when you come to a meeting like this. But I think we have to not be afraid of what the Bible talks about. It certainly uses that language. I mean, if you think the Bible is completely PG, then you haven't read Judges. Jael drives a tent peg through Sisera's head. You haven't read the last couple chapters in Judges because that is the grossest part of the entire Bible.
Song of Solomon.
Song of Solomon is not necessarily the gross part, but it's clearly not PG rated. Okay, great. And it's strange that people will try to spiritualize it and say, "Oh, this is actually what Jesus in the church." No, it's about Solomon and his wife. That's what that's about. It's very clearly that. But some people think, "Well, that wouldn't be included." Why not? God's the one that made marriage. He can talk about that. Are we ready to go?
I think so.
All right, I've been waiting for you because I didn't want them to ask any hard questions, so I'm glad you got it.
Okay.
All right.
Our